If I want a warrior, I'm going to feed them red meat. I want them to have the bloodlust necessary to kill someone. And that comes from hunting and eating red meat.
Do you need that bloodlust?
Yes.
So what do you need that bloodlust for? Maybe I'm a bit scared of you now.
No, engineering's competitive.
Hi Vladimir, it's a pleasure to meet you. Today I'm at Texas A&M and I have a banner that says, "Why aren't you vegan yet?" And you've very kindly been patiently waiting, and I'm really interested to know what your response to that question is.
Well, pretty simply, I'm not vegan because I believe that humans stand above all other animals.
Sure.
And thusly we have a different moral and individual worth compared to everything else.
I'll get into that in just a moment, because I think it's a really interesting statement. I want to know how you came to that view.
Well, I come from a Christian background, first off.
Yeah.
And in Genesis, it establishes that we have dominion over the earth.
Yeah.
Also, it's a matter of consciousness and intelligence.
Sure.
I look in a mirror, I know who I am. Mm-hmm. It's like I am who I am kind of thing. Whereas I don't think animals have that trait.
Not all animals. Yeah, not all animals, I'm sure. So what we've done, and the reason I asked you that second question was I just wanted to establish if it was maybe a religious belief or if there was something else. But it seems to stem from intelligence and kind of cognition seems to be the primary reasons for that, and that makes sense to me. Because what we do have is kind of like a scale, and as you probably heard from my previous conversation, I was using words like sentience and consciousness to describe animals. And so whilst I use those words to describe animals, that doesn't mean that there isn't a differentiation between animals. You know, humans, like I said, with the previous person being kind of at the top of this intelligence scale. And then you probably come down, you have whales, dolphins, primates, and then you probably have pigs and cows and such, and you keep coming down. And so I think that's an absolutely fair ladder to create. And the reason I say that is because let's say that you're faced with a hypothetical scenario where you're in a burning building. And in that burning building, there's a human and there is a chicken. And you can only save one of those lives. Well, of course, there's many reasons why you're going to save the human life over the chicken. And that would be a morally justified thing to do. But let's use the same burning building. But now inside that burning building, you have a 5-year-old human child and you have a 95-year-old human. Now, there's probably a number of reasons why you'd save the 5-year-old human child over the 95-year-old human. But that wouldn't mean that you were arbitrarily allowed just to harm elderly people in society because in an extreme situation you could find a moral reason to save the child over the elderly person. I think the same is true of animals. You can create a difference between them, and you can say, if I had to choose, I would choose the human life because of the criteria that you've used, the intelligence, the advanced cognition, those factors. But we're not faced with that either-or situation. We're faced with three choices. Killing humans, pretty obvious, right? Killing animals, or killing neither. And so I think, and I'm interested to know if you agree or not, but I think that it doesn't really matter if we place humans at the top, because human superiority intellectually doesn't mean that we should just arbitrarily harm animals when we have another option which can reduce the suffering that we cause to animals as well. What do you think about what I just said?
If you're drawing that ladder, why is it wrong that us at the top of the food chain don't act like a shark or a bear or any other animal that's at the top of their respective food chain and is responsible for culling the populations of the herbivores?
I think it comes down to the same criteria that you use to assign humans extra value: intelligence. It's a cheesy line from Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire ones, the good ones, and Uncle Ben says, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And I think that's a really good line, because what I think we have is undeniably power. Firstly, dominion is a word that you used, and we do have dominion because we have the intellectual and physical capabilities to do whatever we want. But with power, you have two real options, don't you? You could be kind of tyrannical with that power, or you could kind of be more nurturing with that power. It's the same with parents, right? Parents obviously have dominion over their children, but dominion doesn't give the right to harm. It creates a sense of responsibility to nurture. And that doesn't mean that we have to do anything extreme with animals. It just means not going out of our way to kind of arbitrarily cause them suffering. So what separates us from, say, sharks or bears or lions is that they don't possess the moral agency that we do. They don't possess the intelligence to be able to rationalize their decisions. So for us, humans, we have not only the intelligence, but we also have the options in front of us. A lion kills a gazelle, well, firstly because they have to, and secondly, they probably aren't able to empathize with the gazelle in the same way that we can with our increased intelligence empathize with the animals who we consume and kill. So let's take this scale again. we've got humans at the top, we've got animals, and then at the bottom of that we have plants. So I agree with you that we can create this kind of like moral worth here, but that's what leads us to veganism. Because if our aim is to cause, reduce suffering, and our aim is to kind of, consume living beings that are beneath us on that chain, then consuming the plants causes less suffering than consuming the animals. And so that's why I draw this conclusion of veganism, because when we talk about sentience and intelligence, they come below animals, non-human animals as well. Does that make sense? What do you think?
Yes, but I don't necessarily completely follow with the absolute reduction of suffering.
Not the absolute reduction. We can't absolutely reduce it.
Yes, but the gap between human and animal suffering to me is just as big as the gap between like animal and plant suffering, in that it's almost they live almost entirely based off of instinct. And yes, I clearly don't think that it's okay to like tie up dogs and have their faces be eaten off by mites or whatever, like true acts of cruelty. But I am okay with, I am eating this steak. I acknowledge that the animal died and possibly suffered for me to eat this steak.
Yeah.
To me, its worth is so beneath me that I don't have a problem with that.
Sure. So, just to go back to the first thing you said in that conversation, you said that the gap between humans and animals is kind of the same or whatever compared to the gap between plants and animals. Forget about the human and animal gap. The important thing is the animal to plant gap. That's what's important. As soon as we establish that morally there is a difference between cutting the stalk of a broccoli and cutting the throat of a pig, we've created that there is a moral distinction between those two acts. So do you agree or disagree that morally there is a distinction between cutting the stalk of a broccoli and cutting the throat of a pig?
No. If both are for food, then no. The difference I would draw is if you're cutting the throat of a pig, you're ending its life briefly, quickly, efficiently for food. If you are slowly torturing an animal, my problem isn't necessarily with the animal being tortured, it's more so with what the person torturing it exhibits that I feel could be reflected if they ever got the power to do that to a human.
Sure. And I understand what you're saying. So by that kind of like implication, are you saying that non-human animals don't deserve moral consideration?
Possibly.
Sure. But there's a contradiction there, because if non-human animals don't deserve moral consideration, then dogs having their faces eaten alive with mites or whatever it was, that experiment that we're alluding to, that doesn't become a moral concern anymore because they don't deserve moral consideration. If there's no difference between cutting the stalk of a broccoli and cutting a pig's throat, then me boiling a cauliflower in the pan is no different to me boiling a dog in a pan. If that's the similarity you want to draw, then morally there's no difference between any of those. But you yourself, by the admission that there are some things that we can't do or shouldn't do to an animal, have already assigned moral worth to those animals.
I think, yes, we do attribute a little bit moral worth to animals, especially when looking at acts of cruelty, because we think, well, what if that was a person? And actually, one of my favorite, I'm a big anime manga fan, is The Promised Neverland.
I'm familiar with it. I've not seen it, but I'm familiar.
I'd say it probably has a fairly strong vegan message.
Explain it to me.
Humans are essentially raised by alien races in these farms for consumption.
Sure.
Now there are distinctions, and you follow the like high quality, because they eat us for our brains. You follow the high quality meat, which are nurtured in a home until they're eventually sent off and then quickly killed.
Right.
And then others are kind of factory farmed.
Sure.
In those cases, the humans are conscious. The humans try to escape. They have moral value, I would say, because of their intelligence.
What aspects of their intelligence? Because I what's interesting, and it does sound like it's got a little bit of a coded vegan message in there. I thought that was what one you were alluding to was about. You're assigning kind of like these humans in this fictional scenario moral worth based on their intelligence, and you kind of said they try to escape. Well, I mean, many of the animals who we farm try to escape as well. They don't necessarily have the means to be able to, although some do achieve it. Often they're either shot by police or brought back to the slaughterhouse anyway, but they do still try to escape. So again, whilst we may say that there is intelligence difference, it's not really the differences that matter. It's about the intelligence that these animals have, and the fact that they can suffer and they can feel pain and they do experience these emotions and feelings. So you use the word cruelty, and so I want to just establish, when you say animal cruelty, how are you defining the word cruelty in that scenario?
Malice on the side of the human that is conducting it, because I don't see a lion brutally tearing apart a gazelle as cruelty, but I would see a human doing a similar act maliciously as cruelty, because once again, as we've established, humans have agency, animals don't necessarily have the same level of agency.
Yeah. So interestingly, you had initially kind of said about, well, other animals do this, so what's the difference? We now have kind of gone past that, and you seem to agree that that doesn't create the distinction, but now you're kind of using that distinction as an alternative justification. So if we accept that we have these differences and we have the moral agency, and whilst I agree that it's unpleasant to watch a lion tear down a gazelle, it's not necessarily fun viewing, but we don't feel morally repulsed by it because of the lack of agency and the necessity that the lion has to do so. But when we see a human doing it, why is it that we then think that that is morally wrong then?
The moral wrongness comes from intent, I think, with humans, because we can have motive. And motive does matter. Like, if a human kills another human, why was that done?
Yes,
and that's why we have degrees of murder.
Absolutely.
You have, passionate, you found your wife with another man and shot them both. I wouldn't say that's morally right,
No.
but that's definitely different than you slowly plan out a death, or you capture, torture, rape, then kill someone.
There are gradients.
Yes. We also morally judge those not by just what is done, but why it was done.
Absolutely.
Person kills an animal for food, they did it for an expressed purpose, and I do think some of the ways that we waste animals is disgusting, and there's definitely problems that could be improved upon without taking the whole system apart.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I hear you. I hear exactly what you're saying. Okay, so the reason why a human doing this to an animal would be down to the motive. Absolutely right. It's just, as you say, very rightly, it's the same with humans. If you shot a human out of self-defense, that act is very different to walking up to a human and just shooting them, undeniably. So motive plays a huge part. And so someone who is just, let's just say, gratuitously harming an animal in front of us just for the pleasure of harm would be concerning to us because of the human and their psychology and what they were capable of. Whilst a human who buys meat in a supermarket, we wouldn't necessarily question their mental health because they're partaking in an action that seems, culturally normalized and doesn't seem like a moral concern to many people, so we wouldn't necessarily have the same fears about that person. So I hear you on that point, and that's a good point. But really what we have to boil it down to then is that idea of motive and intention. So whilst there are clearly discrepancies between those two motives, we have to boil down what the motive is for harming animals and killing them for food. So what is the intention behind that action? It's an obvious question, of course, but let's just start with that question.
The intent behind harming animals or killing them for food is for sustenance, for maintain. I mean, you are going to a cultural element, and yes, it is for maintaining our cultural norms and what we eat, and like what nutrients we choose to take in. Yeah. But I don't believe that norm is a fully. I think that norm is good, and I think that what we do need in our culture. I understand that from a vegan perspective, this compromise probably couldn't exist.
Sure.
But I would like to see those of us who enjoy meat, like we do it knowingly,
sure,
and we do it with respect. I know I'm eating the steak. I respect the fact that this animal lived and died for me. Like the natives, the Japanese, a ton of cultures throughout history have had that respect built in, and I'm afraid that we've lost that, which might be why some people turn to veganism, is because our society has lost the respect, so they go to the extreme of we cannot harm animals at all.
There's a few points in there, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to try and make sure I hit all of them. The word extreme is an interesting word to use to assign to veganism, because I think that not harming someone unnecessarily is not extreme. I think, killing someone even though we don't have to would be my version of extreme. But anyway, past the semantics of the word. Okay, so the first thing I want to establish is the motive and the intention behind why we kill animals for food. So we'll come back to that. And then because we talked about culture and stuff like that, and which is obviously a very important consideration. And then we came down to that notion of respect. Okay, respect for me, and maybe you'll disagree, so feel free to tell me if you do. But when I think of the word respect implies mutuality. If you came and sat down next to me and I just started shouting at you and I was like, you are this and that and this and that, and I'm vegan and I hate you. Do you know what I mean? Like, that would not be respectful. I also don't believe that either, just to clarify. But it also wouldn't be respectful. Even if I sat here and went, I am consciously and knowingly doing this and I'm fine with that, that still wouldn't imply respect. Because respect is about a mutually kind of like agreed upon thing. It's about me understanding your feelings, your desires, your needs, your wants, and hopefully you reciprocating and doing the same. Hence what we're doing now, having a respectful conversation where we're vocalizing disagreement, but in a way that is very pleasant, really, and enjoyable, I find anyway. So that's respectful. But what we do to animals isn't respectful, because it's just this one-sided, biased approach to respect. It says, I can do what I like and kill these animals even though I don't need to, but as long as I'm okay with that and I'm consciously doing that, then that's fine. But consciously causing harm to someone is potentially more disrespectful than unconsciously, because you're knowingly inflicting that harm onto them. Okay, let's bring it back down to this intention again. Obviously, the intention of just gratuitously harming an animal in front of us for not food is wrong. And the reason we think it's wrong is because the intention behind it is just a kind of a selfishly motivated intention. So when it comes to food, we kind of separated the intention behind that into three important things. Firstly, sustenance, then nutrition, and I guess sustenance and nutrition are pretty much the same thing, and then kind of like culture. So the first thing we have to establish is whether or not we can get sustenance from elsewhere. Which we can, of course. We can be plant-based and get sustenance and nutrients from being plant-based, and so that removes that kind of intention behind it, because now the intention isn't for sustenance because it's not a necessity anymore. It's an optional thing, so that's not the intention behind it anymore, or at least it's not a good enough intention. And then it becomes about culture. So the question then becomes, and feel free to disagree with anything I've said, of course, obviously culture does influence morality. There's no denying that it does, but should something be blindly accepted as moral simply because it's cultural?
I definitely think that there are elements within culture that you need to examine, whether it's moral, whether it's not moral. If I went to a nation of all vegans, or, fictional, plant-based only people, I would, as an outsider, have to respect that, because they have made that moral decision. I have a different moral decision, since despite all your arguments, I still place humans where I do. So yeah, I think that's the case with cultural morality, and I also understand that we can get food from other sources. I'm Eastern Orthodox, and kind of like original offshoot from Catholics. Whole church history thing, but we fast multiple times throughout the year with relative strictness of fast, and the reason why 40 days up to Lent or what have you, we stay away from dairy and meat and all these things is because they actually have a psychological effect. So when you eat meat, you are more prone to anger. When you eat dairy, you are and wrath. When you eat dairy, you're more prone to certain other sins. Right. And this isn't just a religious argument. Certain studies that have been connected, or that the church has looked at, have actually psychologically shown that different chemicals within that can modify behavior.
Right, okay.
So if I want a warrior, because like it or not, our society needs them to a certain extent, I'm going to feed them red meat. I want them to have the bloodlust necessary to kill someone. And that comes from hunting and eating red meat.
Do you need that bloodlust?
Yes.
So what do you need that bloodlust for? Maybe I'm a bit scared of you now.
No, engineering's competitive.
Sure.
Life is competitive.
Sure.
And so when I choose to eat meat, I'm choosing to harness, I'm choosing to become a monster and then control that monster to become as productive in society as I can be.
It just feels a little bit insincere because we kind of established before that one of your fears about people harming animals gratuitously was that it would create more kind of negative traits in those humans. Outside of the consideration that non-human animals, deserve, you were fearful that people who harm them would then have these kind of negative traits within them. Mm-hmm. But now you're kind of confirming that people who do eat meat, dairy and eggs are taking these negative traits within them, which was precisely the fear that you had about people that were gratuitously harming animals. And so it seems like you've almost kind of created an alignment between those two concepts by the fact that both create a negative outcome for the humans involved in that as well.
Well, there's a difference of degree there. And I don't want to make the nuance argument because a lot of people that's stupid, but at least in my opinion. But there are bloodlust and like power are tools. So in relative moderation, where you're taking in certain things because of the traits you want to acquire, then you are using those tools to further yourself. Just killing an animal brutally, you're not necessarily feeding the power side of it, you're feeding malice.
Right.
And you're using your power for something that is dark and evil,
right?
At least in my opinion.
Sure.
Whereas if you're eating meat and you are, in a sense, I don't want to sound like some like ancient hippie or whatever culture, but you take on the traits of an animal.
Right.
You can use those traits to protect your family, to be a good husband, to be a good soldier. It's a level of degree and direction.
Sure.
Malice, or cruelty towards animal, high degree of kind of taking or a large power rush with malicious intent.
Right.
Eating a steak, a smaller incremental feeling of power, I guess. But without the malicious direction. I hope that makes some sense.
I mean, look,
it might be totally self-contradictory, but
I think it potentially is partly, and also it's a very abstract thing you're concerning yourself with, and without there's no quantifiable data, of course, to say that consuming a steak is going to increase your mental power. But just to bring it back to what we were saying, because I think I kind of think maybe we've gone off on an interesting tangent, but a tangent that I think is kind of a little bit not so quantifiable and a bit arbitrary maybe. So I'd like to bring it just back, and I'm just interested in establishing this kind of like chain of morality that you have again, because I think that there was and I'm going to use this word insincerity again, just to kind of like, okay, cool, appreciate that, thank you, Vladimir. So I'm going to use this word insincerity when it came to the difference between chopping a broccoli and cutting a pig's throat. Because, like I said before, you've established that gratuitous violence to an animal is wrong, which means that you do think that morally there's a difference between consuming plants and animals, because the things that we'd be against someone doing to an animal in front of us, we might be a bit like, what are they doing? But we wouldn't be so concerned if they were doing it to a broccoli or a cauliflower or a courgette or zucchini, should I say, in front of us. So there is a moral distinction there that we have already ascertained. And so by creating that moral distinction between plants and animals, we've assigned a degree of moral worth to both of those different types of living organisms. And because we've created a difference between those two, morally speaking, I would believe that it's preferable to inflict harm on the living organisms that are least capable of feeling that harm. In other words, inflicting or choosing options that reduce suffering overall. Now, I suppose the question there would be, do you think that morally speaking, A, is that true? But also, B, do you think that the reduction of suffering in situations where we have a choice side by side, the choice of reducing suffering is the morally preferable choice? What do you think about that two-parter?
I think it's in large part, it's economical. In a way, I don't want to totally go back to the previous tangent. But yes, there is a moral distinction. But I've also established I believe humans are another level.
Sure.
So.
But we're not harming humans.
Yes.
We humans are out of the equation. We're either harming animals, so we're either eating animals or eating plants. So that distinction's the only morally relevant distinction.
Yes. I believe the benefits in certain cases from eating animals outweigh the moral difference between the two in, like, I guess, the hierarchy of what has moral value. So their moral value is low enough, in my opinion, that the benefit I gain from exploiting their moral value is a worthwhile trade in my eyes.
And just to confirm, that difference is based on a temporary bloodlust that you get from consuming animal flesh.
I wouldn't necessarily say how.
But you did say that.
I did say that. Once again, bloodlust down a degree and over time, but yes, our position at the top of the global hierarchy means that we have to have a certain degree of power. I believe that it is morally justified with the moral worth of an animal being what it is, in my mind, that we consume these animals to maintain our position at the top.
Okay, so that's slightly different now, because before it was more of like an individual pursuit of like a competitiveness within a human context, but now it seems to be a little bit more of a broader abstract concept of humans need to be at the top, and if we stop eating animals and only eat plants, we're going to become lower down, and that seems to what you were suggesting.
The individual portion, I was speaking about myself personally.
Yeah.
Why I refrain from eating meat at certain times of the year, and while I am okay with eating meat during other times of the year,
right?
For spiritual, religious reasons.
Sure.
As a society, I believe that we need people who are willing to harness and control their bloodlust, so that as a society and as a, I guess, species, we remain at the top. What would happen to our species if we stopped eating animals? I think we would end up. I mean no disrespect.
No, please don't. No, I'm fine. Don't worry. Don't worry about me.
I think we would end up softer, weaker, and other nations that still consumed meat would overtake the United States because they can harness something very primal and very dangerous that we've lost the ability to harness.
So maybe this is where we'll end it. So just to summarize, the reason that Americans should eat meat is to try and stop China from invading America, because if Americans were vegans, they would be too weak to stop a communist invasion.
Well, I'm all for the Red Scare, but in a sense, yes. There are plenty of. I'm not trying to make a slight on vegans.
No, don't worry.
There's a bunch of jokes and memes out there, but I do believe that we need a society that eats meat so that we can still harness some of the primal rage and power to protect ourselves.
Okay. Let's leave it there, Vladimir. I appreciate the conversation. I do just want to end with one final point. Obviously, I find that conversation to be very fascinating, very interesting, and I have to hand it to you. That is an argument that I've never heard before, so credit where credit's due. It was a very unique argument. Yeah, you're more than welcome, Vladimir. But I do think, I just want to kind of put it into a tangible term. I don't think that is a concern you have to worry about. I would like to think that by being in a vegan society, what we would be is a bit more compassionate, maybe a little bit more aware of the harm that we cause. But I also think that vegans can protect themselves in times of necessity. If someone was to try and harm them, they would step in and try and protect themselves. They wouldn't roll over because they're no longer trying to cause or maximize the harm that they cause. So I think in the context that we are describing, I don't think Americans are suddenly going to roll over to the Chinese simply because they're vegan. But what I think will happen is it could encourage us as a society to start to view the impact that we have and understand that actually if we have an option to reduce suffering, then morally speaking that would be the preferable option to take. That's what I think. But it's been a pleasure speaking to you. Have a great day, and best of luck with your engineering.
Thank you.